in about 10 seconds and folks to queue up. Okay, we're live.
All right. Thank you all for braving the elements tonight to join us at the fourth Carceral State Project Symposium, Control and the Carceral State. This is the fourth event in a series of roundtable campus community conversations about the role of carcerality in our lives, what the carceral state is, and what we can do about it as a campus and broader community. My name is Nora Kernitsky. I'm the Michigan Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Egalitarianism in the Metropolis, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the steering committee for the Carceral State Project, which includes Heather Thompson, Ruby Tapia, Ashley Lucas, Matt Lassiter, and Amanda Alexander. As many of you know, the Carceral State Project is an interdisciplinary initiative that supports teaching, research, and public programming and outreach on issues of criminal justice, policing, imprisonment, and inequality. This year, we've dedicated the bulk of our labor to this public program series, which entails a series of community conversations as we gather information and experiences of folks, especially those who have been most directly impacted by the carceral state. In the coming year, the project will launch its signature research project, documenting criminalization and confinement, which will be a massive qualitative research project documenting experiences of those most directly impacted by incarceration, policing, and confinement, and that will make that archive available for scholarly and public use. So please do look for more announcements about that project in the months to come. I also ask that you all mark your calendars for our final two symposium events in this series, the next on March 13th, Community in the Carceral State, as we consider the resilience of communities and possibilities of restorative justice in the face of carcerality. And finally, on April 10th, Beyond the Carceral State, as we think about paths forward and particularly abolitionist possibilities. I also want to mention the Hatcher Library Gallery has been an amazing partner in these events, and tonight they've asked to do an assessment of the use of their space. So you may have found a slip of paper on your seats with directions about how to complete a brief survey at the conclusion of this event. So I thank you very much for that feedback. It'll be really useful to the library as they continue to think about how to best use this space. So tonight, our topic at hand is control in the carceral state, which builds on our previous three conversations about the definition of the carceral state, processes of criminalization, and institutions of confinement. A number of themes have emerged from those conversations that have woven among our many events so far this academic year. And I'll just mention a few now. Certainly the profound violence that processes of criminalization and confinement perpetrate among vulnerable communities, the interconnectedness among the criminal justice system and systems of immigration enforcement and detention, the complex relationship between poverty and criminal justice, and the failure of social services to provide support for vulnerable communities who very much need them. And finally, the racialization of criminalization and confinement and their white supremacist motivation. And I imagine these are themes that we'll continue to return to in tonight's conversation as well. So tonight we'll build on those first three conversations as we seek to explore the insidious nature of state control and surveillance and seek to understand the many policies, practices, institutions, and technologies that contribute to state control. So I'll ask us to consider, just as some framing thoughts for our conversation tonight, how and why the carceral state surveils and delimits certain individuals, bodies, and communities, how that control perpetuates the violence of the carceral state and ultimately limits possibilities for individual and community advancement, how carceral state surveillance and control extends the scope of punitive processes both before and after an individual's formal interaction with the criminal justice system, how control and surveillance pose moral and philosophical problems as punishment becomes not only an act, nor a moment, nor a period, but a permanent state of being, and how control and surveillance foster fear and suspicion among our communities themselves, ultimately undermining trust, intimacy, and bonds of kinship. So as we assembled this panel, we sought a group of experts who could speak to myriad forms of carceral state control so that we might understand a broad range of experiences and the vast reach of that control mechanism itself. So their expertise includes policing and law enforcement surveillance, probation, parole, and other forms of state control after reentry, sex offender registries, criminal background checks, and other forms of compulsory reporting, and electronic surveillance, to name a few. And so while the panelists will provide their expertise in those areas, I also want to urge us to consider how surveillance and control have come to bear in our own communities, and particularly among institutions that we otherwise may not consider to be carceral ones. In particular, what roles do surveillance and control play in our places of employment and in our universities? On that note, as many of you know, surveillance and control have come to bear on our own university community with the recent announcement of U of M's new policy, SPG 60138, required disclosure of felony charges and/or felony convictions. And this is a policy that requires faculty, staff, student employees, volunteers, and visiting scholars who find themselves convicted or charged with a felony to report it to the university within a week of its occurrence. And this is a policy that does build on a number of other university policies that already criminalize our communities, including compulsory criminal background checks for all university employees and required criminal history reporting for undergraduate and graduate student applicants. The Carceral State Project has issued an open letter to university calling on it to rescind SPG 60138 and its related policies. And as the letter outlines with evidence-based arguments, these are policies that overcriminalize rather than guarantee public safety. They reinforce racial and economic inequalities that exist in the criminal justice system as well as on our campus, and have other devastating consequences. Copies of this open letter hard copies are available at the back of the room with instructions about how to add your name as a signatory to that letter if you so choose. I'm happy to let you all know that as of 5 p.m. today, we have gained 1,000 additional signatories to our letter. So thank you to those of you who have chosen to sign it, and thanks to those who may choose to support the letter going forward. Immediately following this panel, we will host a town hall discussion about our open letter and about SPG 60138 in East Hall 1324, which is at the corner of Church Street and South University. If you are unsure of its location or would prefer to walk there in a group, please do gather at the back of the room when this event concludes, and we'll be happy to move there together. So on to the conversation at hand. I will we'll begin asking each panelist to provide their own introduction, and then we will proceed through around 3 rounds of questions. That should leave us, that I'll keep fairly vigilant time asking each panelist to speak for no more than 4 minutes per question, so that we may save about 30 minutes for audience Q&A at the conclusion of the panel. I do want to remind folks that this event is being live streamed and recorded, so please be aware of that when making comments or asking questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to the panelists for brief self-introductions. I've asked them not to be overly modest and to please let us know any relevant or meaningful material about their backgrounds, their organizational affiliations, the agendas of those organizations, and particularly what motivated them to do the work that they do. So with that, I'll turn it over to Renna to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. We'll do that again. Good evening.
Good evening.
There you go. Going to take you to church. My name is Renna Elmir. I am the Deputy Director of the ACLU of Michigan. And I started my career actually as a journalist. This is something that I wanted to do since I was probably 8 or 9 years old. I wanted to tell the stories of my community members. I'm Muslim, I'm an immigrant, and so telling those stories for me my only path was through journalism. And then 9/11 happened, and everything changed for me. And I set my sights on working for the ACLU because I recognized that as far as anti-Muslim bias, anti-Muslim discrimination, and so-called war on terror tactics that were targeting, stereotyping, and ensnaring our community members in the legal system, there was no other organization that was doing that type of work. And so for the past 13 years, I've been with the ACLU, and while my official role is deputy director, which means I do a lot of things like HR and administrative things that I love, nobody else does. I also, some of the program areas that I work on relate to the communities that are most personal to me, immigrant communities as well as Muslim communities. And so what I hope to talk about with all of you today is the way in which law enforcement has used surveillance to control Muslim communities. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Josh Ho. I'm an activist. I could probably be here for a number of reasons. I could be here because I work with a national organization as a consultant called Cut 50. I could be here because I work with a lot of organizations in Michigan, including Nation Outside and the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. I could be here because I host a podcast called Decarceration Nation, but I suspect I'm here because I'm formerly incarcerated and also because I am one of the people one of the over 40,000 people in Michigan who is forced to register, or as you may know it, to be on the sex offender registry. So I think that's probably why I'm here. I wanted to save some time for the next question, so.
Hi, my name's Mary King, and I'm the Executive Director for the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. I became first involved in the criminal and justice system in 1982, so 37 years ago, when I was a student at the University of Michigan, and I did an internship at the Huron Valley Women's Prison. And that was an eye-opening experience. I believe I probably met you back then, didn't I, Mary? Yeah. And my church became involved in doing criminal justice advocacy. And in fact, there are a number of people here from the Episcopal Church of the Incarnation. Raise your hand. Thank you for all of your support. They remain, these many years later, deeply involved in criminal justice reform efforts. I later was called to start a women's reentry program in Washtenaw County, and that led to later involvement in the development of the prisoner reentry program when that first came to Michigan in 2006, and I proceeded to continue with that program until it was essentially defunded, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And now I am working as the executive director with Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency, which is a 60-some-year-old organization that's interested in making both the criminal and the juvenile justice systems more fair, effective, and affordable. And I'm delighted to be here. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because it's not just incarceration that we have to talk about ending. We also have to talk about mass surveillance and how incarceration for many people never ends.
My name is Martin Vargas, and you have to excuse me because I'm sort of new to this and I rely on notes. When I was 17 years old, I went to prison as a juvenile lifer. I sort of followed the biggest predator in the world, as I call it, and that was peer pressure. I let my peers lead me wherever they wanted me to go because I felt I needed acceptance from somebody, and I couldn't find it anywhere else, so I found it with my peers. And my peers were just as dumb as I was. They didn't know anything, just like I didn't. We're searching for something, and we didn't know what. But to make a long story short, I went to prison as a juvenile lifer. On the 21st of February, I will have a year that I've been out. Thank you for that. When I was in prison, I followed that same predator because that's who I was at the time. I broke all the rules that I could get away with. I sold drugs, I gambled, I did violent things that could have gotten me more time had I been caught, but I didn't. And eventually, of course, I was released 45 and a half years later. And I have to say that the reason that I stayed in so long, and not just myself, so many other parolable lifers stayed in prison for decades longer than we really had to, because politics changed policies and prisoners became commodities when prisons became businesses recognized on Wall Street, on the ticker tapes and stuff. So we weren't in prison for the most part because of the crimes that we committed, but because every 2 weeks in certain communities, MDOC paychecks get cashed and the communities start to thrive a little more on the backs of the people that are incarcerated and aren't being released because they don't have to release us. When I came home, speaking on, Dr. Krasinski asked, and I probably mangled your name, asked us not to be modest. So when I came home, I had 4 hours of free time a week on parole. That's all I could stay out without permission. Eventually, not long after that, I got a doing business as number, an EIN number, and I started running my art business. And all of a sudden, I'm a citizen. You know, just with those little numbers, all of a sudden, I'm legal. And I can come and attend sessions like this because somebody, you know, decided that I'm okay now. Before I had that, I was still looked at as a very negative individual, an individual that needs to be watched. Watch him closely. And the MDOC does monitor closely. Every step you take outside a certain zone, they know exactly where you are, when you are at all times. And if you're not where you're supposed to be, they call you and they ask you, where are you and why are you not where you're supposed to be? The point is that there is a great need to reform the GPS monitoring system. Most parolees do not need to be monitored 24/7 for 365 days a year. They just don't, because the majority of parolees are not going to be recidivist numbers. And the majority of the people that actually they do release, especially parolable lifers, are like in the 1% of people who will commit crimes or do something to go back to prison. So there's a lot of wasted money. You guys, taxpayers, are being taken for a lot of money to waste on monitoring systems that are not necessary, and half the time they don't even work. So there is a very, very urgent need to reform this monitoring system. Parolees have a difficult time as it is without this system. I mean, there are times, and I'm sure that you have experienced it, when the monitoring system goes off at 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning because you're laying in bed and there's a thunderstorm going on, or the satellite doesn't catch where you are and it says you're not where you're supposed to be, so the monitoring system goes off, the GPS system goes off. Or if you're in a building that has a lot of metal structures around, it goes off. The reason for that is because the people who are selling these devices to the Michigan Department of Corrections is the lowest bidder. Technology is so antiquated and outdated. So that is one thing that has to be drastically changed and fixed. Another thing, if you don't live near a transit system, if you're living out of town somewhere, it's so difficult to get to your parole officer's office twice a month, to get to health care services if you need them, to get to buy groceries, to get a haircut, for whatever reason. If you don't have transportation and you're living so far out from town, it's so difficult to get to anywhere. So that adds to the frustration that parolees have already. And after a while, I mean, if you keep, there's a saying that says that pressure will bust a pipe. So all this pressure that's going into the parolees' nature, ourselves, eventually some parolees do crack. I'm very, very fortunate that I have a tremendous, tremendous support system. Many of you are here in this room, but I have so many others that support me and have supported me for decades, even when I was inside. But again, I'm fortunate because of that. There are so many, I can't imagine how many thousands, tens of thousands of parolees out there are walking around the streets that don't have a support system. They live in rundown neighborhoods. They live under this weight of frustration that is so difficult to get off. So irritability, self-pity, self-doubt, the lack of self-assurance that we are somebody, parolees, it's only going to make a person eventually go back into the prison that he or she came from, because it's way less stressful in there than it is out here. I really hate to say that, but in fact, that is the case. Again, because I am so fortunate, I have been out close to a year now. I've had 3 art exhibits, solo exhibits, and I've been successful at them all, and I am grateful to the people who made this possible for me. PCAP, of course, was very instrumental in that, and so many other people. I have taught art classes, and in the spring I will teach another art class to refugees at Michigan State University. I have a business. I have been accepted by a society of artists in my hometown in Grand Ledge, and they welcome me, just like my family welcomed me, my friends welcomed me, my neighbors welcomed me, and all my supporters welcomed me. And they allowed me to come in and try to become a normal citizen. If anybody can identify what a normal citizen is, that's what I'm trying to be. I guess I could go on, but if I do, I'm going to be way, way more time-consuming than I should have.
You're going to give it to me?
So I'm going to give it to Monica.
Thanks, Martin. Oh, I thought that's what these were for.
No.
Oh, all right.
I think that's just for like.
I mean, I really got the biggest mouth in the house. My name's Monica Janer, and I was the first prisoner in the state of Michigan to get life without parole on a conspiracy charge, a conspiracy to murder charge where no one died. So in 1978, I began an incarceration and served 28 years. And in 2007, I was blessed to come home under the parole eligibility, life or laws. And when I touched base in 2007, my frustration came with me. I was so angry at what was going on in the prison system and what was going on and people going to prison and the racial issues and the many different issues that go with the criminal justice conversation, that I came home and I actually wanted to go get a job in a detention center. But of course I had to check that box that said I had been to prison and jail. So of course they didn't hire me in an area that I probably would have been the best expert at after working with juveniles inside the facilities. But I started working with a reentry program called ARROW, Advocacy, Reentry, Resource, and Outreach. But as I sat and got myself more involved, I sat on the Community Corrections Advisory Board, the Safe CAPS Board, which is now the Safe and Just Board. I sat on the Prison Corrections section of the state of Michigan. So I tried to get involved in as many things that I could to figure out what was going on before I decided what I really wanted to do with myself. So the more that I sat at the Community Corrections Advisory Board meetings, I realized that the people didn't know what they should do with that front-end money instead of sending people to prison and jail. So I created, I taught my county into starting a day reporting diversion program. I now have people in my office 3 days a week, 3 hours a day. I get rid of their barriers. I work on COGS, jobs, licenses, any barrier, GED, school, high school, college, to get them successful and get them to a great place. I work very closely with probation, parole, GPS monitoring people. So, you know, this conversation is important to me because I deal with the carceral state in many different levels.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all for those introductions. So for our first question, which I've pre-circulated to the panelists, so they're not on the spot. The term carceral state often calls to mind institutions of confinement, like jails, detention centers, prisons. But as we've just heard in our initial conversation, it also comprises a wide range of policies, practices, institutions that scrutinize individuals and communities, both before and after their contact with the criminal justice system. So I have asked each panelist to respond to the following two questions. What forms or practices of state surveillance and control have you encountered in your own experiences and communities, and how has that state surveillance impacted those communities and opportunities for advancement or justice?
You want me to go first? All right. I just want to say I'm in awe of this panel and feel completely out of place and inferior, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my esteemed colleagues on the panel. I think for as long as we've had law enforcement, they have been involved in using secret tactics, secret technology to control groups, particularly groups that they find to be subversive, right? Whatever definition law enforcement use for being subversive. And so if you're a student of history, I think many of you may be familiar with COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. This was a program in which the FBI infiltrated and spied on groups, again, that it identified as subversive in a variety of different ways. This included the civil rights movement. This included feminist organizations. This included the American Indian movement, and so on and so forth, Black Panthers. And this program was designed to not only infiltrate and spy on these organizations and these movements, but also to devastate them, to break them down, particularly breaking down the minds, the bodies of brown and black men in that moment. And so for us, COINTELPRO, right, is this really horrible, sad moment in history. Yet we find ourselves time and again in a position in which law enforcement use surveillance technology and tactics to not necessarily incarcerate people in institutions, but to really incarcerate their minds, creating almost open air institutions where folks' movements are surveilled and they are limited in how they control their work, their political affiliations, and, as I alluded to earlier, their religious beliefs and the ways in which they define their religion. And so, I could talk at length about these issues, particularly the ways in which surveillance has impacted Muslim communities, but I actually think it's far more interesting if I told you a story and shared with you at least one case study, not of the most egregious form of surveillance, but in many ways a pedestrian form of surveillance of Muslim communities, and that is the NYPD surveillance program. Has anybody heard of the NYPD surveillance program? Great. I think this is the most hands I've ever had when I've asked that question. So for those of you who aren't aware, the NYPD and the New York Police Department decided shortly after 9/11 that it would hire a CIA operative to create a program to track and monitor Muslims in the New York area. And I don't mean Muslims that they thought might be up to something. I mean every single Muslim in 5 boroughs, in Connecticut, in Pennsylvania, and in New Jersey within a 100-mile radius of a mosque. That is wholesale dragnet surveillance. And so what they did was they created a what they called a demographics unit, and then realized maybe they shouldn't include the word demographics in a name. So then they called it the Zone Assessment Unit. And they focused on 28 ancestries, mostly Muslim majority countries, as well as American Black Muslims. And every facet of religiosity and outward practice of religion was viewed as suspect. In fact, religiosity alone and the outward practice of Islam was the only basis for law enforcement scrutiny in these communities. And so even though, and you might ask, well, how do we know they were only focusing on Muslims? You just talked about ancestries here, right? Well, we know that there's a large Syrian Jewish community in New York. Those communities were not surveilled. We know that there is a large Egyptian Christian community in these areas. Those communities were not surveilled in this way. The police exclusively focused on Muslims. And so what did they do? Well, they mapped these areas. And they mapped these areas and then pointed out what they called hotspots. And they called these hotspots, or they defined these hotspots as indicators of radicalism, incubators of radicalism. So if you can guess for me, what is a hotspot? What are these areas or locations?
Most likely a Muslim community center.
Muslim community center or mosque, that's an easy one. I'm not going to give you any points for that. Anybody else? Real quick. Only have a few minutes. What's that? Schools. Schools with Muslim majority, or Muslim student associations at universities. Come on, more. Any guesses? Come on.
Just taking a wild stab at maybe like a halal grocery store.
You got it. Halal butcher shops, halal grocery stores, cafes, hookah shops, anywhere in which Muslims were congregating. And we also found, this mapping, I'm talking about New York, but guess what? The FBI was mapping Dearborn in the same way. Okay? And so these hotspots, as I said, were incubators of radicalization, and and the CIA operative designed this program based on a report called The Radicalization of the West that was issued. And in this report, there are typical signatures of radicalization. Can you guess real quick what those typical signatures could be? Remember, the outward appearance of religiosity, religiosity alone. Just beard, yep. Hijab, yep. What's that? Praying, yes. In addition, giving up alcohol was an indicator of radicalization. Stopping gambling was an indicator of radicalization, but of course only if you were Muslim. And so what the NYPD did is it deployed police officers in all of these communities, what they called rakers. And they also deployed informants, who they called crawlers. And they asked them to infiltrate these mosques, infiltrate these community centers, infiltrate these cafes, and then they dumped all this data back into a database that then the NYPD shared with FBI as well as other law enforcement units. This is information that was collected about law-abiding individuals. Because there is no indicator of radicalization other than actual violent behavior. So when you are collecting data on someone who has suddenly grown a beard, that is not at all an indicator of radicalization. And so a couple of things that these rakers and crawlers did, just so you get a full picture of this situation. The NYPD police officers, the rakers, documented once how many times a day Muslim students prayed at a university whitewater rafting trip. That means this police officer actually went with these students on the whitewater rafting trip. Victims of crime and those who were picked up for minor crimes were visited by police officers from this intelligence unit, and they used a carrot and stick approach. We can get you off if you become an informant, or if you don't become an informant, we're going to make your life a living hell in a variety of ways. This happened to both those who were facing criminal prosecutions as well as those who were in vulnerable immigration situations or had family members who were. They documented how many times an Egyptian business shut its doors for daily prayer, or which restaurants played Al Jazeera, which businesses sold halal food products and also sold alcohol, because maybe they weren't as radicalized as we thought they were if they also sold alcohol in addition to halal food products. They sent these crawlers, more than 250 people, into weddings, into community events, to take photos and keep tabs on every single person. They conducted forms of, in addition to kind of the personal surveillance, they also conducted monitoring of websites, blogs, and online forums, what we would call at the ACLU, all protected free speech, free speech protected activities, and they amassed mountains and mountains and mountains of data on these communities. And I want you, final guess, how many criminal prosecutions came out of this? By the way, this happened for over a decade. Over a decade, these communities, every aspect of community life was surveilled. How many criminal prosecutions? Zero. At first, when questioned about this, the police commissioner tried to say we thwarted 14 attacks. When he was pressed on it under oath, that turned into zero. And so with that, I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
All right, so this is the question I was the most worried about, because when I started brainstorming all the ways I've been surveilled, it took, a number of pages, so let's hope I get through this one. All right, so obviously the way that we're all surveilled, I think everybody knows that to some extent, by cameras in our areas, public cameras, by our cell phones, by lots of stuff. Some of it's voluntary, some of it's not. But after I was arrested and before I entered a plea bargain, I was jailed, bailed, and released. But I answered the questions about depression wrong for the first time and spent a few days in solitary in a plexiglass cage in the Macomb County Jail. My DNA was taken, my fingerprints were taken multiple times, a public criminal record was created, a court record was created, the story was covered by the press, and I was followed home by people in the media, which obviously any of those stories stay on the internet forever. I was told to, and that's a marker, I was told to appear and register for the sex offender registry immediately after registering a plea. I had to meet with probation agents in 2 counties about the rules of supervision until sentencing, and they created a pre-sentencing report on me, which I assume still exists somewhere. I was imprisoned, after sentencing, I was imprisoned immediately, first in jail and then in state prison. From that moment on, any time I was outside of prison or jail, I was handcuffed, hand and foot. Upon entry, I was stripped and told to bend over and cough. When I was going through the medical tests, a doctor intentionally groped me while mocking and demeaning me. Otis, which is a system that the Michigan Department of Corrections created, lets everybody know where I was incarcerated and all the information about my charges, where I was housed and my release date, etc. And for those who don't know, people on the inside have their friends call people on the outside to get that information, which creates violence in the prisons. The state figured out how much money I had left in my bank account and seized it while I was incarcerated, so they were in my financial accounts. You have very limited rights in prison. You are constantly subject to full body search. Your property can be searched at any time, and at any time you have a visitor, you are subject to full body search before and after. For any violation, you can be placed in solitary confinement. Whenever I was moved to a different facility, I was transported in chains and at times kept in what appeared to be kennels in what they called the transportation facility, 20 to 40 guys to a kennel, and the only bathroom facility were jugs in the cage, which you were supposed to use in a room with all those folks while still cuffed. At all times on the yard, you could be shot by the officers and in the towers, and almost all of the correctional officers started to carry tasers. After release on parole and probation, I was allowed out of my house for only 5 hours a day and 0 hours on weekends for 1.5 years. Virtually no apartment complexes would rent to formerly incarcerated people, and only one that I know of in this entire area consistently rents to people with a sex offense on their record. I was on electric ankle monitor for 1.5 years. At one point, my parole agent needed to change my monitor and pulled the strap so tight, I asked them to please change it, and my parole agent told me it's supposed to hurt, this is punishment. They charged me more for electronic monitoring than I paid in rent. I had a 3-page list of restrictions, and I was assured that any violation of those restrictions would result in my return to jail or prison. I was told if I was even around someone who had a gun, regardless of if I knew it, I would get a mandatory 4-year sentence while on parole or probation. I was only allowed to have the kind of phone without a browser, and several times had my phone confiscated, one time while my father was having surgery, to ensure I had not broken any rules with it. I was not allowed to be on the internet except to search for employment, and only at Michigan Works, at a Michigan Works office, and that was for a year and a half. I was subject to raids at all hours, usually with a full team in SWAT gear and my parole agent. Often they tossed my apartment just as carelessly as they did when I was in prison. I was forced to spend every Halloween evening at a building adjacent to the Washtenaw County Jail, where they kept us for about 5 to 6 hours. I also wanted to say something else about monitoring, because I have friends who are on lifetime monitoring. As Professor J.J. Prescott of the University of Michigan put it last year, much like a perp walk or a mug shot, the traditional ankle monitor is an archetypal display of criminality. It is regularly referenced in popular culture and satirized in social media and easily recognized. It is expressive. After release from parole and probation, I am subject to a visit from the police every year to make sure I am living where I've registered. When I was arrested, I was on the registry for 25 years. After sentencing, that was escalated to life by new legislation. I have to report 4 times a year to the police to verify my address in person. Most violations of registration technical requirements are punishable by a mandatory 4-year felony prison sentence. That means if I don't register my car, for instance, or I forget to deregister something, it can be a 4-year felony prison sentence. I have to pay $50 a year for the privilege of being on the registry. I am not to loiter within 1,000 feet of a school, even though they didn't really define what loitering meant. People have been arrested for eating a meal at a restaurant within 1,000 feet of the school in Michigan. I must maintain a valid Michigan driver's license. I am subject to international Megan's Law, which means my passport identifies me as having a sex offense and means my own government works against me being safe in other countries. I'm required to have an updated photo on file with the police and on the registry. I'm required to report the following information within 3 business days as part of my registration: address or change of address, campus information of any college I attend, my vehicle information or a change of vehicle, any employer, contractor, or anywhere I volunteer, and any change of employment, all email addresses or internet identifiers, which for me is about 10 pages worth of stuff, any change of name. I also have to let them know who and where I visit for over 7 days. If I travel abroad, I have to register it 21 days in advance and let them know where I will be at all times. Every state that I travel to has a different set of rules for visitation. Most states have a grace period before someone visiting has to register in that state, which creates a new set of obligations and a long list to visit the police station in that state. In some states, the grace period is as short as 48 hours, that's Florida, and others it's as many as 21 days. Where my parents live, it's 5 days, which means if I want to visit my parents, I have to go for 5 days, and that includes the day I travel in and the day I leave. Failure to register in another state is also a crime punishable by imprisonment. That is why, for instance, as I just said, when I visit my parents in Oklahoma, I only visit for 5 days. I'm probably out of time, but I can say that surveillance and control has made me constantly aware of being quite unfree in a supposedly free country, despite the fact, as everybody always says, if you do the crime, you serve the time. I served the time, and I still am not free, and that means this country is not free, and that's all I got for that.
Wow. Thank you, Josh. Wow. And he was talking fast. Could you imagine how long it would have taken had he slowed down? We'd be here for probably another 10 or 15 more minutes. So I'd like to spend some time talking about 4 areas of state control, and that's probation, parole, occupational licensing, and charging all 17-year-olds as adults. So starting with probation, the difference between probation and parole is that probation is surveillance Probation is reporting to an officer. Probation is a sentence in lieu of incarceration. So parole is surveillance and reporting to and supervision that happens after someone has been released from prison. So probation, you don't go to prison. Parole, it's after you get out of prison. Probation is the most common form of criminal justice supervision. There's far more people who have served or are currently serving probation sentences than people who've been incarcerated. And the rates of adults who have been put on probation have skyrocketed in recent decades, and they now count for about 56% of all the adults who are currently under state supervision. And what's ironic is that probation was originally seen as an alternative to incarceration for less serious offenses, but it has grown into an opportunity to be able to widen the net and have even more people under surveillance, more people who have to be under supervision and report. And in fact, it also drives incarceration because there are so many ways in which people can violate their conditions of probation, and often a consequence for violations may include jail time and or prison time. So for parole, when people are coming out of prison, in Michigan, about 10,000 people a year are released onto parole supervision, and another 4,000 are denied parole in any given year in Michigan. Of those 10,000 people that are released, only about 20% of them now are given access to any kind of prisoner reentry services. And that's really important because in the heyday of prisoner reentry around 2010 to 2013, 80% of all the people who came out of prison were able to access those critical reentry services. As Josh also said, parolees have to follow certain conditions in order to keep out of trouble. And what's very disturbing is how many of those conditions are not about committing another crime. So they're being held accountable for behaviors, and those behaviors become criminalized even though the behaviors themselves are not a crime. So in Michigan, about 2,000 people are returned every single year to prison for these kinds of parole violations. That is, they did not commit a new crime, but they violated some condition of their parole. So just do a little back of the envelope math. If 2,000 people are going back to prison at $35,000 a year for 1 year in prison, even if they went back for 6 months, that's $35 million a year for technical parole violators. I want to talk a bit about licensing, because in Michigan, 1 in every 5 workers in Michigan needs a license in order to be able to work in their area. And this discrepancy, this really disproportionately impacts poor people, because in order to get a license, you often have to complete certain training, you have to pay fees, you have to pay to pass an exam. And while there are certain professions that we know you need a license, right? You need to be licensed to be a nurse. You need a license to be an accountant. There are so many positions in Michigan that you need a license for that are a little bit ridiculous. Some of them floor sanders, carpet layers, barbers. And some good news, Michigan just recently scrapped the requirement for painters to be licensed. And why this is really important is that most licensing requirements, or most licenses require that you show that you have, what is it called, good conduct or good moral character, that's it, good moral character, which often sets up a huge barrier for people who have criminal backgrounds. And then the last thing I want to talk about very briefly is the state control around charging all 17-year-olds as adults. If you have a 17-year-old child that you are parenting and your child is arrested, you will not know about it. You will not know they have been arrested. They are under no obligation to tell you anything about any kind of court procedures, because your child is considered an adult in the state of Michigan, even though they're not considered an adult in any other way for any other thing, only if they commit a crime. And we know that youth in the adult justice system are more likely to be victims of sexual assault, they're more likely to self-harm, and they will be haunted by an adult criminal record.
A lot of the things that have been said, if I say much, it would be redundant, because we all know what they just said. I mean, it's obvious to us what you're listening to right now, what you heard from both of these people. It should be more than enough to understand that even you guys, you know, you're sitting here, you have homes to go to, you're free, but you're really not. At any time, just like Mary just said, they can pick you up for even suspicion, and nobody would know where you're locked up at. The state is always surveilling every one of you. A lot of you probably have FBI numbers and you don't even know it. And you know, you just have to be concerned. You have to be open your eyes. You have to listen to what's being said and really listen, not just hear us talk, but really listen and investigate yourselves. Research. You guys all know how to research. So do a little bit of that for yourselves and see if in fact you are being surveilled by somebody. The phone, how many times have you answered the phone? I know I have. Since I've been home, I answer the phone and there's nobody there. You know, are you checking up on me? Is somebody checking up on me? You know, why does this happen? Phone numbers come up from places that are unknown. Habitat, Georgia. You know, is that a city? Is that a state? Is that a place? What is it? Zip codes with only 2 numbers. Zip codes with 17 numbers. You know, who is doing this and why are they doing this? Personally, since I've been out, I have not experienced what other parolees have experienced. I have to be on parole for 4 years because I was a lifer. But my experiences have not been that bad. They haven't been that drastic. The only time that I feel that I'm being surveilled is when I go in to see my parole officer and I'm being asked to take a drug test. And I don't feel that I'm being watched all the time, but I know that it's a rare thing for a parolee to say this. I wish I could add to what these people have just said, but I can't because I would be repeating what they just said. Monica, I know, can speak a lot on it, so I'm going to back away and let her do her thing.
Actually, Josh opened up my can of worms from the day I walked out the door about all the advocacy I had to do for sex offenders, for God's sakes. Yeah, I mean, you come home and they couldn't go see their kids at the football game. I spent a lot of time doing that, trying to figure out all those things. So thanks, Josh, for those wonderful memories. I mean, they call me, the probation officer calls me from the county jail and says, I got a sex offender here that doesn't have an ID. He went to jail for not having an ID and being able to register, and what do? They let him out without ID to start this vicious cycle all over again. It's insane. But, so, you know, when I think about the carceral state, I always think about that book, The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison, because, you know, all of these surveillance are used as tools to keep people in jobs and industries to make money for the rich, and our criminal justice clients pay the price again for that maximum accountability. So, like I stated, I run a day reporting program, and I created this first based on the fact that those closest to the problem are best with the solution, because, you know, I can sit in that room and pay attention. I know what every one of my guys is thinking and what they're doing and where they're getting ready to go. So, you know, I created this in hopes that I could eliminate the mass incarceration problem and reduce it. So I'm coming up with these different kind of ideas with how I could create this. So I created a mental health court, so I now have people coming to us that have mental illness, and instead of going to prison and jail, where you know, when you're in prison and you see all these guys being passed the girls passed Thorazine, and it looks like the Walking Dead show after Medlines. You know, you got to save them from going to prison, because there's absolutely no reason to send them there. What are we doing for them? Yeah, I have those people on the GPSs, and so they get the double consequences. Not only are they on probation, they're on this surveillance. They got to go on the GPS. You know, I've got all these different issues you guys have been talking about. I've got a collaboration with MSU, who called Spartan Fair Chance, who come in and do resumes, employment programs, help me get them apprenticeships, any barrier that that they deal with related to getting a job. And so one of the big things is the background checks, we know, that, you know, come into play. So they're steadily denying the clients because they check that box, or they're honest with the employer. So it's really amazing to me to see these clients go into these job agencies, these temp agencies, and you know, they go to work for 90 days, and then they come back to my office and say, Monica, guess what? After 91, on the 91st day, I can no longer work there because the corporate said they can't hire felons. I said, we can work for the first 90 days for free and not, you know, do a great job and show you what kind of credentials we got. But on that 91st day when the corporate comes in, it's over with for these guys. And, you know, and I can't tell you how disheartening it is for these guys to have to deal with these different kind of things. So, you know, those state surveillances impact our community immensely, because when clients can't feed or provide for their family, they definitely resort back to what they know best, and that's the criminal behavior. So, like I said, I run a program in Ingham County, and in it, you know, I really want to keep my community safe, because I got to live in it now, but at the same time, I want to be mindful of all the people that commit crime. So, you know, we're talking about the obvious with the background checks, the GPSs, and all those different kind of things, but, you know, I want to talk about something that has really, you know, broke my heart dealing with this program. And every one of these guys and girls that walk in my door, it's the clients I work with in my day reporting program, the majority of them are between 16 and 30. 80% of them have had a parent in prison or jail. 87.6% of these people have been in foster care or adopted out. And all of them have many unresolved traumas. So not only does we have the carceral state in, you know, in the big form, but we also have a carceral state for these kids in a surveillance. Because once these parents get arrested, here comes CPS knocking on the door, you're going, yeah. So, you know, it's another form of, you know, surveillance and something that nobody's been talking about. So, so then they come and they've got all these unresolved trauma issues. They use substances. They got all this different kind of, you know, issues going on. And you got to figure out how you're going to peel down this onion and make this person normal at some point, because the trauma that they've been facing, I got clients that had their mothers die in their arms from a heroin overdose. The police banging on the door and taking their parents away. Kids seeing their parents and their best friends getting shot and killed. So nobody's dealing with this trauma. So of course, what does our wonderful John Engler do? He closes down all of our mental institutions and sends them all to prison. So then we've got a whole nother issue of, you know, dealing with that situation. So yeah, I mean, it's just really heartbreaking to see all these different kind of things go on. And so these children that are taken from families and parents are traumatized for life, and the policies created from the parents' incarceration or substance abuse keep the carceral state booming, because, as you can see, these kids up in the criminal justice system themselves. The trauma that these young kids face certainly create trust and security issues, pushes them to find somebody that cares, even if it's at a gang. These young people can't get any mental health treatment as young kids, because there's no money for it in any budget, any state budget. So yeah, it's a domino effect. It's a trickle down. You know, our community should be ashamed of the data that's coming out of these communities where these policies are taking place with CPS, mental health alone. But then on top of the, you know, advocating efforts you got to do, trying to help these sex offenders get through all their different kind of their issues and their ID issues, and how we create the different kind of issues. So yeah, it's definitely had a negative impact in the community that I live in. But you know, I'm working really hard with the prosecutors and the judges and everybody else to see if we can minimize some of this stuff.
Thank you all. So legitimations for carceral state control and surveillance often hinge on issues of safety. The argument many times being that systems, many of which you alluded to, background checks, probation or parole, electronic surveillance, registries, and other practices are necessary to make our communities safer. So I've asked the panelists, in your own experience, does state surveillance make our communities safer? Why or why not, and what other effects has it had on the communities you are each a part of?
No. So I'll expand. I'll start by saying I'm not really one known for my optimism, and so this might be a bit heavy. But I think we could all agree, and maybe not, that white supremacy has grown in this country, and in fact, white supremacist violence has grown, particularly in the last decade or so. Yet, because of misguided, reactionary, biased tactics, policies, practices, it is in fact Muslim communities, and Muslim communities aren't a monolith. There are many, many different Muslim communities. It is these communities that see the discrimination, the surveillance, and the criminalization regardless of what the data shows. And there are actually very many similarities to the ways in which fear alone forces us to put people on registries, including the sex offender registry, watch lists that are bloated. There are millions and millions and millions of people on watch lists. There's no way to know. In some cases, you can't know you're actually on it, and there's in fact very few ways to get off. And particularly if you don't know you're on it, it's even harder to be able to get off. But what law enforcement and our elected officials have done really well is exploit people's fears and public willingness to tolerate aggressive police tactics, practices, and dragnet or wholesale surveillance in our communities, even though the indicators of radicalism that I shared with all of you earlier, even though that is widely considered junk science, widely debunked by anyone who has done any sort of research on these issues. Nonetheless, this is what our government is peddling, and I want to make very clear that President Obama launched a program called Countering Violent Extremism, which very much takes from NYPD surveillance and COINTELPRO and other surveillance programs. And what CVE did was actually it exported or allowed for communities themselves to surveil themselves. So it was a way in which law enforcement can be taken out of the equation, and instead you ask teachers, social workers, religious leaders to spy on their own communities. And so, I say all of that to say we cannot be more safe if we are not free, and we cannot be more safe if our communities and the products of this type of dragnet and wholesale surveillance is our communities don't trust one another. And there are very concrete ways in which that's happening. People are not going to mosque. People are not participating in organized Muslim activities. There is a real suspicion of converts coming into mosques and Muslim spaces for fear that they are actually informants, which is not only a hindrance to the community as a whole, but for that individual, that convert who's coming into a space for religious reflection that harms them. There are, speakers at events are carefully vetted. There are decisions made every day about live streaming talks and etc. There's feelings of There are individuals who are deciding not to wear certain ethnic garb, perhaps even hijab. There are individuals who are shaving off their beards, right? Because if we use these indicators of radicalization as our kind of North Star, as our guidance in this, then behaviors amongst community members are going to change and do so in such a way that only harms their religious freedom, free speech, political activities, and just the ways in which they practice their religion.
So yeah, the question, does state surveillance make our community safer? I suspect that has a lot to do with which community you live in. Safer for whom? For Detroit or for Grosse Pointe? Safer for whom? Ypsilanti or Ann Arbor? You know, it's funny where the surveillance cameras and the police and everything else always are. You know, in the communities where that's happening, you know, we're not really, we don't feel safe. I don't feel safe most of the time. I don't think surveillance saved Tamir Rice. I don't think surveillance saved Eric Garner. You know, he was just selling loose cigarettes. You know, we send people to prison. Is it safe for them? You know, I think Bruce Western raised this question. He's a professor. You know, we count these, you know, what's safety? You know, I mean, we count public safety, but we don't think about all the violence that happens in prison. That is, you know, we're not safe in prison when we're in prison. Miriam Kaba, who's a fairly famous abolitionist, calls prison legitimized and consistent sexual assault. Is everyone in prison safe because we surveilled them or we put them in prison? I don't think so. You know, who deserves safety? You know, who gets the right to safety and why do they get the right to safety? You know, does surveillance make I mean, is it safer for the kids whose parents are in prison? Is it safer for the people who are on the registry or the families of people on the registry? And as you may or may not know, there's a lot of vigilante violence against people because the registry is public. You know, I mean, and so the question to me isn't really, does it create safety? I'm sure for some gated communities it does create safety. You know, the question is, who doesn't it create safety for, and why is that okay, in my personal opinion?
So all of the forms of control and surveillance that we've discussed so far are drivers of mass incarceration. And mass incarceration is expensive in terms of humans, in terms of dignity, in terms of government costs, and ultimately none of it makes our communities safer. And in fact, many of these kinds of surveillance and control actually create the very thing that we fear. Because permanent second-class citizens are not committed to their own neighborhoods and communities if they're experiencing daily exclusion in the form of very extreme housing and employment barriers. So you're asking people to come back and to rejoin society, but everywhere they turn, there's another door closed in their faces. I remember a time when I was talking to an apartment complex in Ypsilanti to see if we might be able to use them as a referral source for a couple of apartments that we were going to pay for people coming back from prison. And they said, we don't take people who have a felony background. And I said, well, what do you consider what the charge was? No. Okay, so what about if the person has been home for a year? No. Well, how about if they've been home for 5 years? No. Okay, how about if the person has a felony conviction, but they have not committed another crime in 20 years? Could they rent at your apartment complex? And guess what the answer was? No. That's right. How does that make us safer? When is it that people are finally done paying for their crime? I don't know if any of you have heard of some new information that's often called the redemption study. But there's been studies done looking at what are the incidents of reoffending, and they looked at people who had committed an original offense and they compared them to people who had never committed an offense or never been incarcerated. And here's what they found. They found that depending on the age of the first offense, so how old you were the first time you committed a crime, and the type of the crime, that somewhere between 3.8 years and 8.5 years of crime-free living, a person's risk of reoffending is exactly the same as the general population. So think about that. Somewhere between 4 and 8.5 years post-incarceration, if someone has not been involved in criminal activity, their risk is no greater than yours or mine, for those of us who have never been incarcerated, of going to prison. So why is it then that there's no statute of limitations on when we stop calling somebody a felon and when somebody has to acknowledge themselves in many public ways as a felon? And the last thing I want to chat about is the for youth, because this is also very important. We lock up kids at 17. We put them in jails. We put them in prisons. We put them on probation. There was an opportunity for the MacArthur Foundation to do a study when New York was still incarcerating 16 and 17-year-olds as adults, but next door in New Jersey, those same children would go into the juvenile justice system. And they looked at kids that were matched up in terms of age and offenses, and here's what they found. The youth that were in the juvenile justice system did so much better in terms of recidivism than the youth that went into the adult system. In fact, the youth in the adult system were 44% more likely to commit another property crime. And here's the shocking statistic. They were 78% more likely to commit a violent offense. So do these forms of surveillance make us safer? Absolutely not.
What you're hearing, I believe, is what you're hearing is a reality of the fact that mass incarceration is the 21st century's form of the 20th century's, form of enslaving people and making them work for nothing. Enslavement is all it is. The carceral state, the mass incarceration. What you're listening to is the reality of the 21st century's form of plantations. And when I first went into prison, guards wore blazers, suits, jackets, white shirts, ties, and dress slacks. That's who the guards were. That's what they wore. That was their uniform. And they did not hold, there wasn't an attitude, there wasn't a grudge against the prisoners coming in. There wasn't a judgment. They were professionals who had been working in prisons. It was like the family tradition. In the 80s, after the explosion of prison and mass incarceration came into the fray, guards with little judgments or grudges against prisoners turned into gangs. And by that I mean they started wearing dark outfits, dark glasses, dark gloves, dark suits, jack boots, tasers, gas canisters. And they acted like they had an attitude against every prisoner in there. Granted, not all the guards were like that, just like not all white people are rich, as a lot of people think. But they were also in their peer groups, and they had to behave like their peers. Even if they didn't have an attitude against prisoners, they almost had to act like they did, or else be ostracized by the people they were working with. And if they're ostracized, then they're not protected if something happens to them. It's a dangerous mix to have inside a prison, especially in prisons that are bringing so many gang members in. So now you have an us against them attitude, and the guards are playing right into it. And there were dozens of self-help programs that were just done away with. And they were replaced with mandatory programs. These mandatory programs were made to make us become aware of our triggers, our, we have to learn our triggers so that we can cage our rage or curb our impulses. That's what these mandatory programs were meant to do. And we have to successfully complete these programs: violence prevention, sex abuse, substance abuse, psychological assessments. But because so many of us had poor social skills, we had to get a GED first in order that we can understand these programs that we had to complete in order to get out of prison on parole. And it shouldn't be so strange that the DOC gets financial allotments for every GED certificate that they get. When I was a kid, and this is just like an aside, and I know my time is up. When I was a kid, I learned to trust professionals, trust doctors, trust law enforcement, trust teachers, trust religious clerics and so forth, because they are good people. That's not the case. Look around. I mean, how many colleges and universities have had so many scandals? The Nassar case, the Penn State case, the Catholic priests, and so many others. How can you trust professionals if you hear about them almost every day? What can we do to make better societies? Hell if I know. I don't know. But surveillance is not what is going to do it.
Everybody always picks up everything you want to say. But I understand that we got to have, I understand that institutions owe the community safe practices and accountability. And the media does a great job of putting that fear. We've talked about that. And it does ease the community mind when they have someone in custody or they change a policy based on one incident, because that's always how it happens. One person does something and we all pay the consequence for that action. But I feel strongly that these systems of background checks, probation, electronic surveillance have a very negative effect on the communities. The major effect that the state control and surveillance has had on our communities is obvious in the way that we keep people in the criminal justice system by putting these systems in place. A good example is the GPS system. I got a lot of guys in my program are on the GPS, and so they get violated if it's not fully charged. And what do you mean if it's not fully charged? It's still charged, for God's sake. But they have to go do jail time for this. Where is that a risk to the community? Because you don't know where they're at 24/7. It's insane. Or they can walk into the house at any time. And not only do the person that's on the probation or parole, but the whole family's affected by this conversation, because the kids are at home, they're going through their closets, their underwear, everything, all those different kind of things. So, that's insane, what they have to do with these, when these surveillance with these GPS. It also, like I said, I got a big thing about the kids that are coming into our future. The kids their parents that are on probation or parole suffer consequences as well. They're bullied in school because they got a dad that's been to prison and jail. They can't tell you that they even have a parent most of the time because they're shamed of where they've been, or they don't have that same pair of tennis shoes. So then they walk out of school. 90% of the clients in my class don't have a GED, and I ask them, why didn't you finish school? And these guys had basketball scouts and football scouts, but because they were being bullied because they had a parent that something was going on. So we've got all these systems in place, and nobody realizes what effect it has on the whole family and the whole community. So do these systems, this surveillance help? No, not at all. When you look at the negative and the positive, it hurts our communities in a very bad way.
For our final question, I've asked the panelists to think forward a bit. and think about what alternative policies or practices would result in safer, more equitable, and more just communities and society. So I'd invite them to answer that question or to impart any other thoughts or wisdom that they'd like to share with our group here today about state control and surveillance.
So I said that I'm not really known for my optimism, so forward thinking is not necessarily something I do. But I will say, I think one of the greatest privileges that you can employ and impart on others is individuality. And I think what you've heard every single person on this panel talk about is the ways in which, whether it's Muslims, whether it's communities of color, whether it's returning citizens, that we're stripped of our individuality and we're scapegoated and targeted based on these broad brushstroke thoughts and approaches to our communities. And so, so similarly, with regards to law enforcement and Muslim communities, the only way to handle issues is through an individualized assessment of wrongdoing. We can no longer criminalize and discriminate against entire communities through dragnet and wholesale surveillance. And so additionally, I think for all of us in this room, things that we can do are to reject any attempts to give law enforcement more tools because we know that those tools will be used as a sword in Muslim communities and communities of color. And primarily, if I could give you a specific policy, right now, and this happens every congressional session, there's a domestic terrorism bill, for instance, that's introduced. Sounds like a laudable goal that we could all get behind, but we also recognize that it's not white supremacists, it's not KKK leaders that are criminalized through a bill that's intended to address domestic terrorism. It is, in fact, Muslim communities and people of color and communities of color that are criminalized through these efforts. So we need to, and I would implore all of us to do this, to not allow our elected officials and law enforcement to engage in reactionary policies that don't actually make us any more safe, and instead hinder our freedom and liberty, whether we belong to these communities or not.
So the first thing that I want to say has nothing to do with surveillance, but every time I try to speak about, anytime I'm invited to speak, I always try to raise these two issues. The first one is that you'd have to be willfully blind to walk into a jail or prison in the United States and not see the racial disparity. If we don't start there, if our solutions don't start with addressing racial disparity, they're not going to address racial disparity. So that's, first and foremost. The second thing I want to do is give a shout out to Huron Valley, which is the women's prison in Michigan. It's right down the street. They've had a pretty rough couple of years. It's severely overcrowded. They've been dealing with the scabies, well, what they're calling a scabies outbreak for the last several years. They were under quarantine and weren't allowed to have visits a couple weeks ago. I just want to make sure that we remember that when we talk about prisons and jails in the abstract, that we often erase the difference between men's and women's prisons and the needs of men's and women's prisoners. So now for surveillance, I believe the answer, if we really care about public safety, is to address the root causes of what causes crime, as opposed to these kind of things we make up. Instead of surveilling communities, terrorizing communities, and starving communities of the resources necessary for health, we need to invest all of the savings from getting rid of things like surveillance and mass incarceration into those communities and to addressing the real problems, which are things like education, lack of economic opportunity, etc. That's where we have to start if we really want to have safe communities, is to allow people to succeed. We need to ensure that everyone, and that includes everyone incarcerated and everyone who's formerly incarcerated, is guaranteed their basic human rights and dignity. We need to stop pretending that what we're doing is increasing safety or protecting society and start being honest about what we're really doing, which is enforcing race and class lines. We need to end registries. They're counterproductive. If you don't believe me, you can read the recent heavily cited amicus put out by our Attorney General, Dana Nessel, who goes into a pretty serious detail about all the reasons why registries as they're currently constructed are terrible. I will admit I was a little bit reluctant because she's a former prosecutor, but after I read that brief, I will be leading the charge for her from now on. And I finally want to conclude with a quote from, believe it or not, a court decision that came out in Alabama this week because it really sums up what I feel about my personal community. Sex offenders are not second-class citizens, and anyone who thinks otherwise would do well to remember Thomas Paine's wisdom. He that would make his own liberty secure must guard, I'm going to say he or she, would make his own liberty secure must guard even his or her enemy from oppression, for if he violates this duty, he establishes a precedent that will reach to him or herself.
So here are some of my suggestions for new policies and practices that are based on science and not on fear. For probation, we need to develop intermediate sanctions so that when people do have an oops moment and there is a violation, that there are sanctions other than sending people to jails or prison. Ideally, this would happen in tandem with improving supervision as a whole so that there are fewer conditions or demands, that there's more assistance for people who are on probation, and that there are tighter guidelines for revoking probation. For parole, similarly, I think we need to eliminate incarceration for all technical violations. I think that we need to also review those parole conditions and get rid of the ones that have nothing to do with criminal behavior. Completing a psychological evaluation might be a parole condition when you have no money and no way to get a psychological evaluation. Here's one of my favorite parole conditions. You're not allowed to associate with a known felon. Now, you know, I'm sorry, but as Monica said, people often have somebody who's a known felon in their family. So are you supposed to not associate with them? That's a ridiculous parole condition. Licensing reform. We need to remove the good character requirement. And I would also say, bigger picture, we need to eliminate what I think are some unnecessary and arbitrary licensing requirements so that not just formerly incarcerated people, but also people who need economic opportunities can avail themselves of licensing or can avail themselves of a job without a license. I think we need to support clean slate legislation. And we need to develop a clean slate legislative statement in Michigan that says that all felonies will be dropped from your record after a time that meets the evidence-based standards. Right now, in order to get an expungement in Michigan, you have to be convicted of one felony, no more than one felony and 2 misdemeanors. And for those of you who know anything about prosecutors, they routinely charge people for multiple offenses for one event. And they plead to get people to plead down so they don't have to go to trial. But what that means is that when there was an expungement event in Detroit, there were over 200 people who came, and there were 8 people who were eligible for expungement under the current laws. That has to change. We need to eliminate criminal conviction questions on employment and on housing applications, and we need to start here at U of M, gosh darn it.
Yes.
And we need to raise the age in Michigan. We need to stop sending our 17-year-olds to adult prisons and jails. And if you specifically want to do something to help that, in the back of the room, there are sets of postcards. One is for your state senator, one is for your state rep. You don't have to know who they are. In fact, we'll fill them out because we'll make sure that it's up to date with the new legislators. All we need you to do, if you live in Michigan, is write down your name, your address, and your email, and we'll take it from there. And I can tell you that when we show up at the legislator's office with stacks of postcards that we've collected from all around the state, it makes a difference. So if you have a minute to do that, when all is said and done, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
along with that, those postcards and stuff, in the back of the room, there is Michigan Bar, State Bar of Michigan Prisons and Corrections section position statement on the use of monitoring and GPS systems, if you're interested. It's a very, very good piece of information that you should have. In regards to getting serious about changing surveillance and stuff like that for the communities, I would start with, first of all, you don't need, I strongly believe that parolees are not the ones that you should have to worry about, because you know where we are at all times. It's the people that are coming up that haven't been to prison yet that you should be concerned about more than parolees. So don't surveil the people that have been in there and where you know they are, because you know where we are already. The people that are out there that you don't know where they are could be right next door to you, 2 blocks down the road, upstairs, downstairs, whatever. Those are people that could be the next prisoners going in and the next parolees coming out. So don't watch us, because you know where we are and what we did already and what we can do now, which is stay home. But what should be done seriously is create...
That's the answer, staying home.
That's right. Create serious correctional facilities with real programs, not fake programs. And prisons should not be businesses. If it's a correctional facility, then damn it, correct something. Correct people that go in there. Make prisons more civil, less crowded, no more than 500 people per prison at the most, because the more prisoners you have, the less people are going to be treated. The more people are going to fall through the cracks. Believe me, I've been in prisons with 1,200, 2,500, 5,000 prisoners in there when Jackson, the world's largest walled facility, was still intact. There were 5,000 prisoners in there, 3,500 guys walking around every day. You didn't know who was who. It was a community in there. You couldn't provide programs for that many people. It's impossible. So make them less crowded. Make them with real light, not that fake stuff, 25 watt bulbs because the lights are on 24/7, 365 days a year. Provide real rooms, real food, real professionals that are in there. Don't fake it and just start building warehouses. Build places that are going to actually do something. Create facilities for the mentally ill and staff them properly. You have to do that. You can't mix the mentally ill with hardened criminals, hardened predators, juveniles. Don't mix them all together, because that is not the way to correct anything. You're just creating chaos is all. And stop placing juveniles with adult predators. Stop wasting taxpayers' money on across-the-board GPS monitoring. If necessary, by the practices exhibited, monitor and put GPS on the people that have shown that they should be watched closely, but not across the board on every parolee that comes out that has to do 4 years parole, or all the sex offenders. Be very, very, accurate about who you monitor. Use up-to-date devices, not the antiquated ones that are sold to the highest bidder to produce. And instead of punishing parolees for not having a job, help us find one. Provide job-seeking skills or resume writing programs that could instill self-assurance and self-confidence so that we can go out there and say, hey, look, this is who I am. Yeah, I've been to prison, but this is what I can do. Give us those skills. And for those without transportation, and believe me, there are many, many, many parolees that don't have transportation. Provide it. Give us that so that we can get to places that we have to go to complete our parole requirements. I think this will result in safer societies.
Well, I hate to have to go behind Mary and Josh all the time, because we sit at the same tables. I mean, when I sit at Nation Outside, I'm a national cohort of the Just Leadership USA, so I travel all over the country and try to look at what other people are doing, try to get different things going. And that's what the key is to the conversation. We need more people to come out and start, telling their stories, doing those different kind of things, because it's those light bulb moments that people have that change the dynamics of in the hearts and minds of people. But the goal that I work for, within my community, in both advocacy and in programming, is to dismantle the carceral state, the logic behind it, and also by changing the ideology in the minds and hearts of those in power. I mean, we've actually changed the dynamics of the Get Tough on Crime in the last 5-6 years, and it was people going out and telling their stories and doing what they do best. Just sharing those stories, but I work to create evidence-based programming that creates successful clients so that we can reduce mass incarceration, because that's a pet peeve to me. There were so many people in prison when I was there that did not belong in that place, and it served no function for them to sit there and do absolutely nothing. Take them out of away from their families and their communities so that we could watch their kids come behind them and do the same thing that they did. We need to keep our parents at home. So, my first advocating effort was to get the Department of Treasury to allow a payment plan to pay off driver's responsibility instead of making them get the whole payment before you can start driving. How are you going to get a job and not have a car and get to work? It's those different things that we go in and we talk to our legislators about, and they realize that it makes a whole lot of sense to do these different kind of things. But it takes time and people to go out there and do that. But in my community, like I said, I sit at the Community Corrections Advisory Board, and I sit there and I've created different programmings that have been shown to work. My success rate is 87%. We're doing amazing. Ingham County has the lowest recidivism rate for the last 3 years in the state. So what we're trying to, I spend most of my time downtown at the prosecutor's office and in the judge's chambers. Can we do this differently? Right now I'm seeing, and we've got MSU, the biggest sex scandal in the country, and we've talked our prosecutors into not putting people on the sex registry that have the date rape or the different kind. They've got a new charge now in Ingham County called seduction, and they're on probation instead of going on the sex registry. It's those things that you go in and you kind of talk to these people and make them realize the logic. Let's not ruin this kid's life that made that one mistake. And I can remember when one of my guys that worked for me, he looked at the charge. He says, seduction. I would have been in prison 1,000 times for this one. But I mean, seriously. But people don't realize that we send people and we charge people with the craziest things. So we work with our prosecutor to get them to see the logic. So what we've created is diversion. We've got mental health court now. If they complete mental health court, their conviction is gone. It's wiped, right from the start when they walk out the door. So it's those kind of things that dismantle this mass incarceration conversation. So, and everybody can do it in their community. You just got to walk in the door and start having these conversations.
Join me in thanking the panel for their generous contributions. So we have just about 15 minutes for conversation and questions. The weather conspired against us a bit this afternoon, but happily we'll be able to continue our conversation at the town hall discussion immediately following the conclusion of the panel. So Ashley is going to deliver a microphone to anyone who has a question or a comment. I'm going to suggest that we take at least 2 at a time and then invite the panelists to respond as they wish to.
Thank you. Some of the suggestions that you have made, or most of them, involve either legislation or they involve policy. So that means administrators and legislators. So I'd like to direct the question to you.
Okay.
Why don't you hold those feet to the fire by inviting legislators, city councils, county people, legislators in the state legislature, administrators, especially in the city government of Ann Arbor, but other cities as well in Michigan, to come here so that we can hold their feet to the fire about these things?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I really value the suggestion. It's one that's come up in our conversations.
Good evening. My name is Heidi Lucken, and I was the person on the inside of the HR department at the city of Detroit that started and got the box banned on our application. And, the real person that started it was John Cromer. He's one of my favorite returning citizens. And when I was at their city of Detroit in the HR department, single-handedly, I hired about 80,000 people. And I want to encourage you when you begin your career, or if you're in your career now, to encourage your employers to hire felons and returning citizens, especially people still on paper, because I'm going to tell you right now, they are a great employee, okay? They are never late, they show, and they do, and they want to be there, and you'll be happy to keep them after probation. And I don't mean, you know, I'm adding some humor to that, but I'm sincere that we have to stop the cycle of recidivism and all the other things that you've identified that happens to returning citizens. And in relation, I'm really saying all that to say, in relation to the University of Michigan's HR statement recently, the biggest problem in the workplace today, I find, and specifically in HR departments, is a failure of cognitive diversity. When you get into groupthink and monocultures in your hiring departments, you die. And that's what you have now at the University of Michigan. So they've got to do, you know, in addition to solving, you know, resolving this issue, it's not a healthy department. So you're going to start seeing more reactive stuff like this come out of them. So the big thing is when you go, have a solution, because people don't know how to ban the box. So when you get ready to ban your boxes, have a solution for those leaders and decision makers. And that's all I wanted to share. I hope to get a directory of services from you guys tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Young people, it's good to see you here, and I hope you continue come to things like this. We need you. We need you with our community organizations, our grassroots organizations, and the things that are taking place in this climate of need to change our society. I have a question, and I'm sorry I wasn't here early enough to get the name, but you indicated not to give more tools to the law enforcement regarding the credence for surveillance. Can you expound on that a little bit in terms of the tools you're speaking of?
Sure. I think there are many ways in which I would define tools. One way is laws that allow them limitless surveillance powers for everyone, right? We're not just talking about returning citizens, but for all of us, and the ways in which our privacy is violated daily by law enforcement. So there's the policies, and then there's the ways in which you know, we have a Department of Justice right now that very much believes in the militarization of our police forces. So that actually expands beyond surveillance and into equipment like tanks, right? So Oakland County has armored vehicles for, I have no idea what for, but you know, there are ways in which our law enforcement is being handed money to militarize that, again, does not make our communities safe, and in fact creates barriers between community policing and communities. These are already, at times, communities that are vulnerable, that distrust law enforcement. And so when you have law enforcement go to a home on a call about domestic violence, and they're in full SWAT gear practically, that doesn't breed confidence, doesn't help individuals address the vulnerability of the situation, and adds to the trauma. We also know that in many of these situations, vulnerable individuals have already gone through some sort of trauma in their past, especially with law enforcement. And so we have to think about the ways in which, through laws, through policies, through practices, and through equipment and money, we are creating greater and greater and greater gaps between our ability to allow police to engage in community policing and communities themselves.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much.
You know, I do a lot of reform work, both nationally and around Michigan. And I have a theory, and you know, I mean, a lot of this is about strategy. And I have a theory that, at least from my perspective, what I'm trying to do is undermine the foundations that undergird a lot of that, little by little, piece by piece, until the logic of it falls under its own weight. I think of it a little bit like the Underground Railroad. I keep trying to get people out, as long as they'll let me get people out, and keep trying to do things to change things, as long as they'll let me keep doing it, until there's so many of us around and so many things we've done that the thing just collapses. So I think goals, I'm definitely 100% with you. And I think a lot of the times when if I'm talking to law enforcement, or if I'm talking, in my head, it is, for me, it's a lot of the time strategic, because it is true that it is almost impossible right now to move anything without those people involved. So I think it's important to make sure, and it's not that I personally have any animus to every single person, but it's the structure of that thing that's wrong. And so I think that the more we move to undermine the logic of why they have that power through the things we do, the less power they ultimately have. And at least that's my hope. That doesn't mean that I'm right. And maybe it's true that we just need, and maybe it's an Overton window question, that the reason we haven't moved to doing that is because no one thinks we can. And I hope that's true too. Did you want to?
Hi, I would just like to
question or comment be our last.
Is there another one? Is there somebody else with a question or comment?
Any final comments from the panelists before we?
I'd like to say one thing. Thank you for what you just said about telling our stories and stuff. One of the things that I feel I have to say is that what really hurts me is because I haven't been out that long yet, according to the Department of Corrections, and what hurts me is I saw a neighbor who needed some assistance, some help, and I couldn't provide that because it was outside my zone, you know? I'm not that kind of a person. I can't see somebody needing help and not do something to help them. And that just really, you know, it's not right, you know? That's another form of imprisonment. You're imprisoning my being, my soul, my character to go out and help somebody that needs some help. But because I can't cross that line, I'm sorry, I can't help you, you know? And that's sick.
I also forgot to say one thing. I think it's really important that we start to challenge, I mean, you don't have to, you can do whatever you want, but start to challenge our language choices a lot. You know, I mean, for instance, I committed a felony. I'm not a felon. It doesn't totally define who I am. I committed a sex offense. I'm not a sex offender. Actually, we prefer registered citizen, or my new favorite is people who are forced to register, so.
I have to just say one more thing. My favorite is just normal. I'm just a normal person.
Human being works, yeah.
I just want to point out, you know, because you and I should talk sometime, because I tend to be the one who's always looking for that silver lining in the cloud, right? But one of the things that gives me so much hope is literally looking out in this audience. There are so many people in this audience right now who have made criminal justice reform, advocacy, their lifetime passion. And I just want to, I'm afraid I would forget somebody if I called you out by name, but I would like folks to raise their hand if they have been involved as a volunteer or professionally in some aspect of criminal or juvenile justice reform. And take a look around. Now, doesn't that give you hope? Because together we can do this thing.
It should be on.
On that note, thank you so much for that. I just want to really encourage everyone who's sitting here. You've sat here patiently for a long time listening to these amazing speakers. But this is here right now at the University of Michigan. This week we have the exact policy on the table that everybody up here has been talking about as one that devastates people's ability to feel secure when they get a job here, one that dissuades people from even applying to go to school here or to get a job here. And so we really encourage you. It's cold, it's nasty, you've been sitting here a long time, but we strongly encourage you to pack up your stuff and follow us over at East Hall to have a different conversation now, a more targeted conversation, related, of course, about the University of Michigan and what it is as community members and as state taxpayers and as employees and as faculty and as students of this university that we think about this and what we might all collectively together suggest about what we might do differently. So please let me strongly encourage you to follow us over despite how late it is. And Nora, you take us out with our last comments.
Well,
can I just say also community people, the largest employer in our community.
Absolutely, the largest employer in this region.
I'll just say thanks to everyone here and thank you again to the panelists for a wonderful conversation. So please join us on each hall, like Heather said.